Okay, hey all, I'm back. This is the second part of the Friday follow-up video for our first week of class. The first video we talked about the feather pillow, and in this second video I want to talk about the two Little Red Riding Hood stories. Obviously, I read these two stories in relation to one another. I don't know how you cannot do that. The second is a modern adaptation, a modern kind of reimagination of the older Little Red Riding Hood tale. The first one, as I told you guys, right, the first one is from probably the most famous edition collection of fairy tales, into the 20th century, and that was from 1697, right? So, what, 350 years ago, something like that. So that's the original Little Red Riding Hood, and there are many versions of Little Red Riding Hood, but that's probably the most famous of them. So 1697, the end of the 17th century, and then the new one from the 1970s and the 20th century, about 50 years ago. And so we have these two different versions, and I guess I wanted to throw out a quick literary term here at you, and that's the word intertextuality. Intertextuality. That's the idea. This is a term that literary critics use and literary scholars use. It's a term that refers to the way in which different texts, shape each other and talk to one another, right? There's a kind of intertextual dialogue that happens. And so, I mean, these two stories are a great example of intertextuality, where one story is shaping and forming the other story. And they kind of go in both directions, right? The later one rewrites the first one, but it makes us rethink how the first one worked. But this idea of texts talking to one another, intertextuality, they shape each other. It's a key idea in literary studies, and one, that's really prominent among English scholars. So I wanted to mention that to you. A good example of intertextuality here. But I think there's all kinds of crazy stuff going on in this intertextual dialogue between the two stories, and I thought you did a great job with this, right? You were all over it. I think the sort of most insistent interpretation for me is the one that unfolds in relation to gender roles. I think that the earlier story, the 1697 story, I think we can read that as a fairly familiar assertion of traditional gender roles. That is, young women need to be careful because the world is filled with men who are after them. It seems pretty clear to me that this is coded in the story that men are hunting them. It's coded as a sexual threat, right? She even in the early story, right? I think this is the case. She takes off her clothes and she gets into bed with him, right? So the kind of encounter happens in this sexualized framework. It's a fairy tale from the 17th century, so it's not like explicit sex or anything like that. But the suggestion is there, right? It's sort of around the edges, around the margins. So the idea, the thing to be afraid of, according to this story, is that men want to take your virginity, right? Men want to have sex with you as a young woman. And maybe more particularly than that, I think that the story wants to warn young women about how tricky and deceptive men can be. They will say or do or act in whatever way they can to get you. We could have probably a long and lively conversation about how accurate we think that is or is not, or how that might be potentially problematic. But I think that's the sort of traditional value system that's being laid out here, right? They'll do whatever they can to get you. And this is where the figure of the wolf, or more specifically the werewolf, becomes important, because the werewolf, of course, is a shapeshifter. It's somebody that turns from a man into a wolf, or a woman into a wolf and back. It's a shapeshifter. So, nice guy to ravenous wolf. In that way, the image of the werewolf underscores the fact that you can't trust men, even the gentle looking ones, right? That's what it says in the moral of the story at the end of the first version, right? Even the gentle ones, they can be the most dangerous of all. You can't, the werewolf underscores this fact because they are not what they seem. They can transform into something else. And you have to be very careful about that. You have to worry about that. And I think, along the same lines, this figure of the werewolf works well, right? Because the notion of an inner beast, this idea of an inner beast, it fits nicely with the idea of sexual desire. The idea being that underneath the cute and charming surface, this is what the story implies. Underneath the cute and charming surface, men conceal kind of monstrous sexual desire, desire that will turn them into a wolf, right? And they'll come and eat you up. So, yeah, I mean, I think that those kind of gender dynamics inform that first story, right? And they seem kind of very, very traditional, maybe to our 21st century point of view, problematic in some ways too. But that's what's going on there. And then along comes the Angela Carter story from 1979. And I think the Carter story kind of takes those ideas and turns them on their head. And you guys were all over this, right? You guys had great comments. You were talking about, the way in which this is a story in which we have kind of a more confident, more empowered young woman in the story. And I agree with it, right? I mean, that's the way that I read this story too. I mean, I'll mention, as some of you did, right? Her version of the story is written in the 1970s, and this was a period of dramatic cultural change in terms of women's rights and gender roles. And so it perhaps comes as less of a surprise that this story gives us a more empowered, powerful Little Red Riding Hood. There's lots of evidence for this in the story, and you guys did a great job of picking up on it, right? There's the knife she hides in the basket. There's no knife in the first story, right? There's no sense that Little Red Riding Hood could pull a knife out and deal with the wolf. But here, she's got a weapon. She takes a weapon, right? So she's taking some of that power for herself. So there's the knife in the basket. There's her general confidence. She just, I'm not afraid. I'm not going to die here. I got nothing to worry about, right? Her confidence, her desire too, maybe most interestingly, her desire, right? Women's desire. This is something that does not exist in that first story as far as I can see. So her desire for a kiss from the young man. She wants the kiss. So she goes more slowly to her grandma's cabin, hoping that then he'll get there first and he'll get a kiss from her, or she'll get a kiss from him. And then, of course, there's the ending, which is dramatically different in this story than in the first one. And she takes charge here. Let's just take a quick look at the ending. Let's see. Okay, so here we are at the very end of the story. Do I have this on the wrong one there? Here we go. So, I mean, think about how different this is than from the original story. He's doing we're doing the whole routine, right? What big arms you have, et cetera, et cetera. And then we get to the climactic moment in the first story, right? What big teeth you have. She saw how his jaw began to slaver, and the room was full of the clamor of the forest Liebestod. But the wise child never flinched, even when he answered, right? There's her confidence, never flinches. And he says, all the better to eat you with. And, right, I mean, this is the moment in the first story, that's the end. All the better to eat you with, he jumps up and gobbles her up, and she's dead. That's the story. And then you get the moral, right? Not here. All the better to eat you with. The girl burst out laughing. She knew she was nobody's meat. It's a great line, right? And a couple of you guys fixated on this line. She burst out laughing. She was nobody's meat. She's not a victim. I'm not here to be eaten by you, right? And the fact that she's laughing at him, right? The silliness of this. Like, I reject this whole, I'm your victim, you get to do with me whatever you want. I'm laughing at that, right? She laughed at him full in the face. She ripped off his shirt for him and flung it into the fire, in the fiery wake of her own discarded clothing. The flames danced like dead souls on Walpurgisnacht, which is like in German folklore, it's the night of April 30th, when witches dance on mountains. And the old bones under the bed set up a terrible clattering, but she did not pay them any heed. So, right, she's taken charge of the situation, and she seems to be, my reading is that she desires this interaction with the wolf, right? She takes his shirt off for him. Carnivore incarnate, only immaculate flesh appeases him. But then, so that's an echo of a line earlier in the story, makes him a scary guy. But then, right, she will lay his fearful head on her lap, and she will pick out the lice from his pelt, and perhaps she will put the lice into her mouth and eat them, as he will bid her, as she would do in a savage marriage ceremony. Somebody noted that, the fact that monkeys pick lice out of each other's hair as a way of kind of caring for each other. I thought that was a really interesting observation here, right? A savage marriage, it's a marriage ceremony. It's not a kind of exploitative abuse that's happening. It's a coming together, a marriage, and maybe even a kind of caring thing, right? She lays his head in her laps, picking out lice. The blizzard will die down. The blizzard died down, leaving the mountains as randomly covered with snow as if a blind woman had thrown a sheet over them. The upper branches of the forest pines limed, creaking, swollen with the fall. Snowlight, moonlight, a confusion of paw prints, all silent, all still. Midnight, and the clock strikes. It is Christmas Day, the werewolf's birthday. The door of the solstice stands wide open. Let them all sink through. And then the last line, right? See, sweet and sound she sleeps in Granny's bed between the paws of the tender wolf. So, yeah, this is a very different image. This is an image kind of consummation, right? It's like the afterglow. They've had sex, and she seems to be happy and safe and sound there with this sort of wolf that she's somehow married to now. So a radical rethinking of the ending of this story. Okay, yeah. So I think that I think the story, as I said before, I think it reverses the old gender dynamics of the earlier story, and we get an empowered Red Riding Hood. Red Riding Hood who is an agent of change for herself. She's in control of her own adolescent sexuality here. Some of you noticed how she burns the scarlet shawl that's made for her by her grandmother, and I think that's a great image of the way that this young woman can be seen as rejecting the old value system, right? The thing that was made to protect her by her grandmother. She's like, I'm done with that, and then she takes charge. Of course, I think that the shawl can mean other things simultaneously. This is the sign of the sign of a rich symbol, right? So I think it can mark that kind of generational change, but also, I think it's linked to loss of virginity here, right? The shawl, the idea, right, that supposedly with the loss of virginity, there's often blood, right? It's linked explicitly to menstruation in the story, so. Right, a marker of her adulthood. She's begun to menstruate. The title of the book that this is from, the larger collection, is called The Bloody Chamber, Angela Carter's book, right? And I think it's not too much of a stretch, I think, to read the title of that book as kind of a metaphor for the menstruating womb, right? I mean, this is something that Carter talks about in other stories in this book, so I think this is on her mind. So yeah, I mean, the red shawl is a really rich symbol in this story here. But it certainly dovetails, it certainly goes along with this idea of reading this as the more empowered Little Red Riding Hood. Okay? So, I mean, I'll wrap up the reading there. You guys were doing a great job with this. I thought the annotations were fantastic. I wanted to use this story in particular in relation to the older version to underscore one of the kind of central claims of this course, which I mentioned in some earlier lectures, and that's the idea that horror fiction reflects the ideas and values and fears and desires of the time in which it was written. And I think that comes across loud and clear here. Okay. So yeah, great job with the annotations. That's it for this week. I'll be back in soon with next week's lectures and lessons. Okay? Right on.